If you haven't seen it already, check out parts 1 and 2. Now, off we go. John F. Kennedy became the first Roman Catholic President of the United States, which had been used against potential candidates in the past. There hasn't been one since. He was one of the first presidents to really use television to his advantage. The invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, which he inherited from his predecessor Eisenhower, was a disaster. His presidency saw the erection of the Berlin Wall around West Berlin, heightening tensions between East and West. Kennedy sent even more military advisors to South Vietnam, who were fighting the Communist North, though Kennedy may have been planning to withdraw. When it was discovered that the Soviets were building missile silos in Cuba, Kennedy went through a very stressful 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, where they were on the brink of World War III with the Soviets. But because that would have resulted in mutually assured destruction, Kennedy and Soviet leader Khrushchev came to an agreement and nuclear war was avoided. Kennedy furthered the space race, aiming to have a man on the moon by the end of the 60s. He greatly limited nuclear weapons testing internationally with the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. He also set up the Peace Corps volunteer program. His presidency also saw the civil rights movements rise in the deeply divided South. Racial segregation was still in place. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas in November 1963. Officially, it was Lee Harvey Oswald who fired the shots, but he was killed 2 days later in a jail transfer, leading to a huge series of conspiracy theories. Off you go, comment section. Kennedy's Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson became President. Johnson sought to get rid of poverty and social injustice through his Great Society, supporting public broadcasting, Medicaid, Medicare, education, social and rural development, and the arts. He was a very domineering person and could coerce people to get things done. His work on civil rights saw the banning of racial discrimination in public places, housing, the workplace, and made voting rights fairer, Johnson having previously opposed Harry Truman's push for civil rights. Racial quotas on immigration were also done away with. Johnson put ground troops in Vietnam, and the war dragged on with rising casualties and anti-war sentiment at home. As his presidency went on, civil unrest grew, riots in many cities stoked by the assassination of civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr., and Johnson wasn't seen to be doing enough about it. Richard Nixon was the president that saw the Apollo 11 mission to the moon. His visit to communist China led to an opening up of trade and communication with China. He helped bring about an easing to the Cold War with the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and SALT I agreement with the Soviet Union in a time known as détente. He ended US involvement in Vietnam in 1973. Because the US continued to aid Israel in their fight against various Arab nations, these nations held an embargo of oil to the United States, resulting in Nixon overseeing the rationing of gasoline. Nixon's presidency, however, is most infamously remembered by the Watergate scandal, in which his staff attempted to cover up a break-in to the Democratic National Headquarters in DC. The revelations that followed were that Nixon was secretly recording conversations, bugging offices of political opponents, and used the FBI, CIA, and IRS to investigate activist groups and individuals for personal use. Facing impeachment and removal from office, Nixon resigned, leaving Gerald Ford as president, who subsequently pardoned Nixon. After the whole Watergate thing, Congress curbed a lot of powers of the president, so Gerald Ford wasn't the most notable of presidents. He did sign the Helsinki Accords, which was signed by 35 states and sought for better relations between East and West. Ford had become Nixon's vice president because his predecessor resigned due to the Watergate scandals, so Ford is the only person who has served as president and vice president and having not been elected for either office. Recession hit under his presidency. Jimmy Carter became the 39th president, and he oversaw peace talks between Egypt and Israel and the promising of control of the Panama Canal to Panama in 22 years. He oversaw an inquiry into the 3 Mile Island incident where a nuclear reactor in Pennsylvania went into partial meltdown. The Iran Revolution led to 52 Americans being held hostage in Iran for 444 days, and an energy crisis with a lack of oil coming from the Middle East. The hostage-takers wanted their deposed leader, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, returned from the USA, so they could hang him for being a corrupt oil puppet of the West. But Carter wouldn't yield to blackmail. They eventually returned the hostages looking for help as Iraq invaded Iran. Carter also saw the SALT II agreements, which were never ratified as the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, ending détente. Because of this, Carter led an international boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics. Beyond his presidency, Carter set up the Carter Center, campaigning for human rights and environmental issues, and won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002. Former Hollywood actor Ronald Reagan became president in 1981. His economic policies, known as Reaganomics, was a sort of trickle-down economics where they'd reduce regulation and allow big business to make more money, and thus this money would trickle down to the people on the street. Apparently. Early in his presidency, Reagan survived an assassination attempt. He sought to increase the war on drugs, resulting in increased incarceration of people, and the drugs were not defeated. He also ignored the AIDS epidemic in the United States for years, resulting in a lack of AIDS research and 70,000 people dead by the end of his second term. He pushed for ending the Cold War, but not before escalating it by reigniting the arms race and working on ballistic missiles and space lasers. True story. Reagan bombed Libya in retaliation for the bombing of a discotheque in West Berlin, frequently used by US troops. Through the CIA, Reagan sought to arm mujahideen in Pakistan to fight the Soviets in Afghanistan and bleed them. Some of these mujahideen would go on to form the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. His administration was caught in a scandal as it secretly sold arms to Iran via Israel in order to free hostages in Lebanon and fund anti-communist Contras in Nicaragua. Well, that wasn't complicated. Having come close to nuclear war in his first term, Reagan and the Soviet Union signed the INF Treaty to reduce arms. Reagan famously challenged Soviet leader Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall. Months after his presidency ended in 1989, the wall came down. George Bush became president and before the end of his first year invaded Panama, deposing their former pawn Manuel Noriega. After Iraq invaded Kuwait, Bush waged war on Iraq in the Gulf War against Saddam Hussein. His presidency saw the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, and the active promise to reduce nuclear arms. A poorly recovering economy led Bush to losing his campaign for a second term. Bill Clinton saw the longest period of peace and economic growth in American history. He signed the North American Free Atlantic Trade Agreement, allowing free trade between Canada, USA and Mexico, leading to more prosperity in the 1990s. He reformed welfare and signed in health insurance for children. In 1998, Clinton became the second president to face impeachment for lying about an intimate relationship with White House intern Monica Lewinsky in a sexual harassment lawsuit, but he was acquitted. Clinton ordered military intervention with NATO in the wars in Bosnia and Kosovo. He denounced Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and he also helped facilitate peace talks between Israel and Palestine. There was a budget surplus towards the end of his presidency. George W. Bush, son of George Bush Sr., became president in 2001, becoming the second president since John Quincy Adams to have had a father as president also. He won a dubiously close election. Only months after he started came the September 11th terrorist attacks, in which Afghanistan-based terrorist organisation Al-Qaeda crashed planes into the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in DC. Bush's reaction was the war on terror, going to war in Afghanistan and later, along with Britain and other countries, against Saddam Hussein in Iraq, in search of weapons of mass destruction. This dragged-on conflict led to the destabilisation of Iraq and the ultimate rise of the so-called Islamic State. Another reaction to 9/11 was the Patriot Act and other acts giving the NSA unbridled access to information on people to find terrorist activity. That worked a treat. Bush became known for his bumbling moments of public speaking. He was elected for a second term, but his popularity waned as it was clear he handled the war in Iraq badly, along with poor leadership in the aftermath of the devastating Hurricane Katrina. Questions about torture and treatment of prisoners in Guantanamo Bay didn't help either. Bush did make tax cuts to the rich and made education reforms. The financial crisis of 2008, stemming from unregulated banks selling worthless mortgages to each other, led to Lehman Brothers Bank failing. All other banks panicked and led to a global recession. Bush was practically on autopilot towards the end of his presidency and handled the crisis poorly. Barack Obama became the first African-American president of the United States. Being born in Hawaii, he became the first president to not be born on continental America, and he has the birth cert to prove it. Obama was the first president to really use the internet effectively in his campaign. Obama brought in measures to try and fight the effects of the recession, including some regulations on financial bodies. He also brought in affordable health care for more citizens, which annoyed many in opposition, because who wants to live in the only industrialised country without health cover? He repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell for homosexuals in the military. Same-sex marriage also became legal during his presidency due to a federal loophole. He sought to reduce nuclear arms with Russia, promised to close Guantanamo Bay, but that seemed more complicated than he thought. He bombed Libya against Gaddafi and ordered the operation resulting in the death of Osama bin Laden, one of the masterminds behind 9/11. With an ever-increasing number of mass shootings across the United States, Obama frustratedly spoke out on gun control, an ever-growing issue in the United States. He removed troops from Iraq, and the power vacuum, as well as the Syrian civil war, led to huge gains by the so-called Islamic State. Obama also continued a drone strike campaign against the Taliban in North Pakistan, along the Afghan border, using unmanned bombers, killing many civilians in the process. Obama signed the Paris Agreement, an international agreement on climate change. His presidency saw a nuclear arms agreement with Iran, and Obama began better relations with Cuba after decades of enmity. The last years of his presidency saw civil unrest amongst African American communities, protesting against violence and systematic racism towards black people. Obama certainly was one of the coolest presidents in United States history. The campaign for the 45th president saw the first major female presidential candidate, Democrat Hillary Clinton, wife of Bill. The Republican nominee, however, would ultimately become one of the most controversial choices in US history, hijacking the establishment's game and playing by his own rules, businessman and celebrity Donald Trump. Despite being seen to be a racist, xenophobic, misogynistic, bully and liar, Trump convinced about 20% of the population to vote for him, which won the Electoral College vote, despite Hillary winning the popular vote by close to 3 million. Both were very unpopular candidates, resulting in quite a few faithless electors. For many, it was a vote against the establishment, as Clinton didn't offer much change, and for those whose reality sucks as it is, when you got nothing to lose. At the age of 70, Trump would become the oldest person to be elected as president. The rhetoric Trump built on was very reminiscent of 1930s fascism, and some called it out as such. Despite promising to drain the swamp and end corporate bankers' hold over government, he surrounded himself with many advisors and administrators who seemed to be the swamp. Even before his inauguration, questions were raised about conflicts of interest with his children running his private company, relations with China, Russian hacking leading up to the election, Trump's distrust of the CIA and the media. But, to quote the great British broadcaster Alistair Cooke, the rest you know. Thanks very much for watching, guys. These have been intense getting them ready for Trump's inauguration. If you want to see more, please show your support through Patreon. Thank you so much for everyone who has supported so far. Don't forget to subscribe and follow me on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram.